Welcome to Exploring Santa Cruz on ksqd.org. My name is Jean Kratzer. I'm your host for today, and it's my great pleasure to welcome Martha NITZBERG.
Thank you so much. I appreciate being here. My name is Martha NITZBERG. I'm an Interpreter 1 at Natural Bridges State Beach.
Just a little more than a year ago, in November 2019, we did a previous interview, and during that interview, you spoke about the monarchs, and in particular the Western monarchs, and you talked about their history, their life cycle, their numbers historically and last year. I've asked you to come back and do an update because recently there was an event that happened.
There was a Thanksgiving count, which happens every year. We go to all the overwintering sites. It's done by citizen scientists. People are pretty experienced in looking for the butterflies and knowing the groves in their area. Up and down the coast, people go to the same sites every year looking for clusters of butterflies flying, butterflies sunning, any monarch butterflies that they can find in these groves that are the overwintering sites. What I mean by overwintering sites are they're usually within half a mile of the ocean. They generally have some component of a eucalyptus part of the grove, if not the entire grove being eucalyptus. If you go back maybe 240 years ago without eucalyptus, probably they were using the pines, we believe, but then there wouldn't be the nectar of the wintertime. So we're looking for the butterflies and seeing what they're doing. Are they sunning themselves? Are the trees blooming? Is there ivy growing up the trees? And that's a really important fall nectar source. Are they utilizing that nectar? Is there any nectar? What are they doing? And where can we find them, and are they there? Last year and the year before, in all of California, the totals dropped to a level where the advocacy group, the Xerces Society, got really concerned because they decided that 30,000 monarchs up and down the western part of the United States is kind of a critical number. Both years, the numbers were just a little bit below that, and it was very much concern about that. And then this year, numbers dropped way down.
How much did they drop?
I believe the official number is about 1,800, whereas it had been almost 2,900 the year before.
For
all of California.
And what about locally? How did the numbers change locally from last year to this year?
I believe in my blog with you, I said something about Santa Cruz having about 6,000 to 7,000 butterflies last year, whereas this year in Santa Cruz, we had about 700.
So it went from 6,000 to 7,000 down to 700 in 1 year.
Yeah.
That's terrifying.
We would go to about a dozen sites within the Santa Cruz County, and these are all within half a mile of the ocean. And they're little tiny places, usually by a stream, usually kind of around where development has gone on the edges of where it is. Maybe it's considered a park, maybe it's near a park. All these little sites are really vulnerable. And that is a really huge concern because anybody who has private property around the edge, the trees that are the wind block trees, protecting them for the winter storms in the site where they're going to cluster, may be the trees that are in somebody's yard that they want to remove. Eucalyptus has a really bad name now because with all the fires, everybody's hypersensitive about concern about fire, understandable. But it's very, very, very difficult for the monarchs because they need these groves, these little tiny places where they can find redundancy. So if one grove, a tree falls down and the wind blows through, there's another grove that would sustain them through the winter. They really need to have this redundancy. In our Thanksgiving count, it was concerning because one of the sites there had been a fire, and another site we noticed some more trees were down. Another site there'd been some trimming of trees, and that was a concern. And here at Natural Bridges, we desperately try to plant in trees before the wind gets too strong and we see limbs coming down, and then we have to figure out how to patch that hole up and try and protect the grove. So habitat is super, super important.
When I spoke about an event earlier, I was actually thinking of the fact that recently the monarch butterflies came up for a special status as endangered species. What happened to that status?
They decided in whether it should be listed as an endangered species, that there were 8 other things that were more important to list as endangered. Part of the trouble with all this is that the Western population is not unique. Monarch butterflies also are east of the Rocky Mountains, and those butterflies go down to Mexico for the winter. And as long as there's not a horrible, horrible freezing event, there were a few years where these freezing events happened, 2002, 2004, 2010, and 2016, where it was so cold that there was a huge, huge die-off as the cold came down through the trees and killed a lot of the monarch butterflies that were overwintering in Mexico. So our hope is that the weather is mild in Mexico, that those overwintering sites do really well. Inland, there's been milkweed planted in the Midwest and North, and our hope is that the overwintering sites there can hold them well, and that as they move inland and north, they're able to find lots of milkweed. And that's the trouble here in the West. It's something that the Xerces Society just realized. They did a little study of all kinds of different areas.
Could I ask you just to spell Xerces? People may want to look it up and they may not know how to spell it.
Xerces. It's named after a little blue butterfly, the Xerces blue butterfly. It became extinct in San Francisco. And so as an advocacy group for butterflies, they decided many decades ago that the perfect name would be Xerces, because then that would be a reminder, never again, don't let this happen. The Xerces Society started off because they realized people didn't understand about pollination and the importance of pollinators. I was reading that in parts of Great Britain and parts of China, it's actually the people that have to spread the pollen. They use little paintbrushes to go from one flower to the next flower to be able to have certain fruits that they want. And I just don't want that to happen. Our young folks should have a better life than that. This year, one of the scientists from Xerces went around and was testing the milkweed, particularly in the Central Valley in California, but testing the milkweed in different places, conventional and organic agriculture places, wildlife refuges, urban areas, nurseries. There's all these different places. They were looking for many, many different kinds of pesticides. And so as they tested the milkweed, they were testing if they could see traces of any of these different kinds of poisons. And even in the organic places, they found traces of quite a number of poisons. So that was a huge concern.
Explain the importance of the milkweed.
Yes. So many caterpillars of different kinds of butterflies are picky eaters, and the monarch is particularly picky. It only eats one kind of food. The only kind of food that it will eat in the whole world is called milkweed. And there's many different native species. There's about 13 in California that are native. There's one that's in the deserts. There's another one that's kind of a swamp milkweed found in wet areas. Some mountain milkweeds where they're found at higher elevations. Historically, the climate and the milkweeds were timed exactly with the butterflies. The sun in the spring and summer would be warm and the plants would die back where the caterpillars had grown up, and those new butterflies would move inland to a new spring. And they'd find if they went inland to the north and the west, or they went up in elevation, that there would be spring again. They'd find the flowers, they'd find the milkweed and everything they needed. And it takes about 1 month to become a butterfly, and they live for about 2 to 6 weeks. So generation after generation after generation after generation are happening in the spring and late spring and early summer and late summer. And then in the fall, the sun angle is low, temperatures drop, milkweed has died back naturally, and the butterflies are triggered by the cold. It's time to shift my hormones, migrate to a place near the ocean where the temperatures don't get too cold, under the trees that are like a blanket for protection, near the coast by the big ocean where it's warmer, and then we can survive there. And looking for each other, nectaring along the way, finding the last of the flowers of the season as they move to the south and the west, following the sun angle coming closer and closer to the coast until they come to the Santa Cruz area and other places up and down California where they find these trees by the coast that are so important for them for surviving winter.
To be clear, it's not the butterflies that are eating the milkweed, it's that they lay their eggs on milkweed and the caterpillars hatch and eat the milkweed and only milkweed.
Correct. Yes. And the butterflies, when they come out, they only can drink because their mouth has changed to be like a straw. So as a caterpillar, chewing and chewing and eating only milkweed. And then as a butterfly, they're drinking nectar from flowers. And this is where all of you come in, your gardens and your life and your choices. A lot of us in Santa Cruz area say, oh, good, this is organic. That means it's safe. It's true. It's a lot safer than choosing the things that are conventionally grown that might have really human-made poisons on them. That's very important. In our own gardens, there's something that I've learned within this year. I was talking to a professor in Eastern Washington, and I was asking about some of the things that he thinks are the issues for this year. Why did the butterflies not get up to Washington State this year? He's always worked the last few years with inmates from a prison, and he has the people that are on good behavior raising up seeds and growing plants, then giving them eggs, and they have the whole life cycle. They've been tagging the butterflies the last 2 years and releasing them. I mean, talk about symbolism. And so the butterflies, not this year, but the last 2 winters, were found. Some of the butterflies with tags on them were found in Santa Cruz, which is pretty amazing. So we know that they're coming also not only from the Rocky Mountains and east and north, but also they're coming from the north in Eastern Washington. That's been really important to know that information. Also, another tagged experiment that gives us information is in 1996, there was a tagged butterfly experiment here at Natural Bridges. When the butterflies left Natural Bridges with tags on them, those butterflies were found elsewhere, and they were found in the Bay Area. So we know the Bay Area is a really important place to have milkweed. And historically, that's where they would have been going. So that's really where we need milkweed.
Have we lost milkweed from the Bay Area?
Absolutely, yeah. In my own lifetime, I've seen the places that were weedy places in between development turning into development or pavement. And then the really huge change happened in the late 90s, and we saw it at Natural Bridges. Our numbers went from 127,000 to 10,000 in 1 year. What had happened when we looked to the Bay Area, what was the change? Well, instead of mowing the roadsides and railroad tracks throughout the Bay Area, they were actually herbiciding. They were using glyphosate. They were using Roundup to poison. So instead of having to pay somebody several times to come mow along the roadsides and railroad track, by spraying, they got rid of everything, including all the milkweed. This was a huge blow to the monarchs to lose all that milkweed. So we've been telling people about planting in their gardens, and then talking to the professor, I was asking about, well, planting in your gardens, is there any dangers or things that we could do in our gardens, anything we could know about? And he said, you should research neonicotinoids. So Jane, I'm going to give you this. It's a 2-page list from the Center for Food Safety from April 2013. And I feel ashamed that only now am I learning the true names of some of the pesticides that are being sold under the name of organic. Why organic, and how can it be a pesticide? Well, anything that kills insects is a pesticide. And if it's made from natural chemicals from natural plants that people aren't creating, then it's considered organic. So these things sound, tree and shrub control, vegetable insect control, lawn and shrub protect and feed. These things sound really good. They're organic, but these companies have these chemicals like imidacloprid, imidacloprid or something. I don't know exactly how to pronounce it, but how would you ever know as a consumer going in if it didn't say nicotine in the product? All of these products are called neonicotinoids. It was not used very much at first, but more and more products are being made with this, and it's getting more and more easy to get these products out with the title organic.
Do you have any brand names for them?
Well, yeah, for the manufacturers, Bayer Advanced, Arista Life Science, Valent USA Corporation, Bayer Environmental Science, Volunteer Purchasing Groups, Syngenta Crop Protection, the Scott's Company, Gulfstream Home and Garden, Rainbow Tree Care Scientific Advancements. So they sound, totally fine, but they do have this chemical in it. And apparently for the honeybees, some of them are getting lost. They are changing their rhythms, and so their dances aren't making sense to the other bees, and sometimes they're getting lost. But it's not just bees that are affected by this. The moths and the butterflies are also affected by that.
If the monarchs had been successful in being given endangered species status, what would that have changed? Because it sounds as if they're almost on the verge of extinction.
Well, it's difficult because the eastern population and the western population are the same butterfly.
So they're lumped together.
So they're lumped together. So that's one of the big things, is that it doesn't look like as a butterfly they're going to go extinct. But our population here in the West is incredibly threatened. And that was the hope, that it could get the status of endangered, because then you could get more government monies, more habitat monies, more protection monies if it was on the endangered species list. Now we have to refer more to grants, corporations, nonprofit, volunteers, that kind of thing, to help the monarch butterflies. One of our docents has started working for Caltrains, and she said there is a little ray of hope. When it's threatened, when it's been asked to be listed, when it's up for looking at it being relisted, they'll look at it again next year. And any project that's coming up for development, they will consider that it probably will be on the endangered species list, and any project coming into the future, they will treat it as such. So how can we make it not be endangered? Well, the Xerces Society says 5 miles from the coast or inland, milkweed was once native and it can be planted. They're really, really advocating that we use the natural native species. There are other species that are tropical, and the monarchs often prefer them, but because they don't die back, they have a tendency to collect spores of a protozoan. So if people wash their milkweed plants, if they have any, that would really help the monarch butterflies. So if you're living inland, our whole long summer, butterflies may be passing through, they may be dropping scales on them. The scales might have spores, and any caterpillars growing up could eat those spores and become infected. Also, if butterflies are raised and they don't migrate, then they don't leave the diseases behind. And so the mothers become more and more and more infected with each generation in the year. And instead of the strong ones leaving and migrating and coming back, they become more and more and more infected. And that's what we've been seeing. It's been kind of frightening. Last year, we had a microscope and we were testing the butterflies for OE. The scientific name is Ophrysistis electroceras. And this protozoan builds up if the milkweed doesn't die back in the winter and come back. And on the coast of California, we never had milkweed. And so in trying to do a good thing to raise up a whole lot of butterflies and have a ton of milkweed, we may actually be harming them more by getting this infection rate so high that the young are actually crippled or can't open up their wings and can't fly. And so we're affecting the population and their health if we have too many grown up locally and we get this population disease increase. We were testing last fall. People brought us caterpillars. They didn't have enough milkweed. They wanted us to raise it. We have a little storage area where we have light coming in and we grow some plants so that we can show people caterpillars and chrysalises so that people inland that come to visit us in the park can get inspired and excited. And then also local people can see the whole life cycle because it's not natural in our area. We don't usually have this, and it's a pretty special thing, especially school groups, especially now. So people the last few years that brought us their caterpillars when they didn't have enough milkweed, and they said, please, could you finish raising it? We would finish raising them, just a few, not to change the population, but just to educate people about the whole life cycle and the amazing life of the monarch and how beautiful they are and how amazing they are. Then we would test each of the butterflies. So last fall, most of them were fairly clean. But this year, at the end of summer and early fall, almost all of the butterflies that we've been testing have been with disease. It's been really, really, really concerning. We don't do this to the natural population. So those that are migrating, that are coming here for the winter, that we're talking about with the clusters, we're not talking about those. We're just talking about the few individuals that people had that they tried to grow up inland and brought to us and said, could you test them? That kind of thing.
Would you recommend that anybody who grows milkweed that doesn't naturally die back, cut it in the winter to imitate the idea of dying back naturally? Would that help with avoiding this disease?
I think that it would help with our local Santa Cruz butterflies, definitely. You have to cut it back and kind of cut it back again because the falls are becoming so long and so warm. It's really not the fault of the milkweed. It's that the butterflies haven't gone through reproductive diapause. Diapause means to wait or to pause. So I mentioned through the spring and summer, they become a butterfly after about a month. And then they live about 2 to 6 weeks, moving inland to find milkweed and doing it again. And then moving it inland, the new butterflies, to find milkweed and doing it again with the new butterflies. So through the season, multiple generations. Now, the fall is a trigger. The cold triggers them to change their hormones. And so their hormones shift. They're in an adult form, but they are pausing and waiting because their hormones have shifted because of the cold that makes them not interested in mating and instead be interested in converting nectar, which is like sugar, into fat, because fat is a really important storage. If they don't get this cold snap, they may not get this trigger and they may want to mate. And if they find milkweed, of course, they'll lay their eggs. And so later and later and later in the season, they'll find more milkweed and they'll lay their eggs, and the whole population will keep on doing this instead of holding their energy, changing the hormones, shifting into this overwintering mode and surviving in the trees over the winter. A concern is that if they don't get into this mode, they may not have that trigger to convert the sugars to fat. In which case, in the winter, there's so few blooming things. And so if they aren't in this really fat mode, then they aren't really fit and able to survive potentially through the winter time. So that's a huge concern. And then also, if they have this disease, OE, it's a big long story, but I guess I should say, if you're a caterpillar and you're eating the milkweed leaves and there are these spores, think of a mushroom, spores from this protozoan that are on the leaf, and you get those into your body, it will grow up inside you, but caterpillar to caterpillar doesn't infect each other. But then as it's forming within the chrysalis, as the butterfly is getting ready to emerge, the OE goes out through the center part of the abdomen, outside of the abdomen, and spores are deposited on the outside of the abdomen. And those spores can fall off as this new butterfly flies from plant to plant, milkweed to milkweed, dropping its scales just like we drop our hair. And so there can be some for the caterpillars to eat. But even more importantly, if the butterfly is very infected, then they can also get infected through mating, even more infected. And then when she lays her egg, the spores can get on the egg. So we've been testing the butterflies before any are released by taking a little piece of sticky tape and sticking it on the tip of the abdomen, looking at it under a microscope and seeing if we find these spores. Sometimes it looks like there's pepper that's been thrown on the slide because you see so many spores. And that would be a very, very infected butterfly that would probably have a huge effect on the population. So that's really, really dangerous for our population, I think. So if a butterfly has a really high OE, then as it's coming out, the OE is moving through the abdomen, making holes. And as our local scientist calls it, leaky. And so that means that the butterfly has to drink more, it has to eat more, it's not as fit, it's not as healthy, and not finding nectar, it can be really difficult for it to be able to survive through the winter. So even if it does shift the hormones and everything's right about that, if it's very infected, then it may not make it. Now its offspring, if it's very, very infected, it may not even come out properly. One of the things that we see is that a caterpillar is wriggling out of its skin and it's like it almost loses energy. The skin is just stuck on it. The chrysalis is partway out and it just never turns into a chrysalis. Or if the butterfly is coming out of the chrysalis, sometimes the chrysalis skin gets stuck on the abdomen of the butterfly and it can't pump up its wings properly, or it just falls to the ground and it's not able to have the energy and strength to be able to pump up its wings to be able to fly. So these are some of the hazards of having populations that don't migrate and having this infection build up.
This sounds pretty depressing.
Yes, but one of the hopeful things is that if people are raising just a few butterflies, the Xerces Society recommends, just a few butterflies a person raise up for inspiration and love. But they recommend front end, if you find an egg, that you wash the egg. So if you wash the egg with a very light bleach solution or even a little soap solution, and you make sure with a microscope that there's no OE on it, then up front, you know that the caterpillar that's emerging is going to be healthy.
How will people recognize a butterfly egg?
Well, it's about a little bit bigger than the period on your computer screen. It's small, it's white, it's on the underside of the milkweed leaves, and it takes a pretty good microscope to be able to see the spores because they are very, very tiny. They're just little tiny black dots under a microscope. There's people that are learning how to wash eggs to be able to help people that want to do it. For instance, schools. It's such a wonderful project as a kindergarten or first grade teacher to be able to have the milkweed. But how do you know that you're raising up healthy butterflies? Well, as more people get trained in how to wash the eggs and make sure that they're clean, that's really hopeful. The second thing that's really easy to do, it just takes time and it takes caring, and that is to wash all the plant material that you feed the caterpillars. When you're planting your garden, there's many things that you can plant that help different species of butterflies. So milkweed inland maybe for the monarchs, but how about here on the coast? If you have a garden and you want to grow up something that would raise a swallowtail, maybe you'd plant some willow in for one species of swallowtail, or maybe you'd put some fennel. Be real careful because it really spreads a lot. That would help you grow up the anise swallowtails. Or if you want to have the buckeyes, they like plantain. They're the little brown ones with the eye spots that people recognize. If you love butterflies, you can help by planting all kinds of larval host plants. Now, if you love to have your plants looking beautiful, it's a bit difficult because you and those caterpillars are going to have a competition for your plants. If you're planting these larval host plants, you might want to plant them behind your flowers or behind your other things in those sunny spots where they can find them, but it would allow them to eat down the plant that they need and grow up as a butterfly.
Thank you. I have the feeling that we should check in with you again next year and hopefully have good news.
Yeah, and here at Natural Bridges, I'm always looking for where are the holes and a couple of trees that we might be able to plant in to try and keep the growth safer here. And it's been our whole community helping with this effort. Everybody that helped plant the cypress trees in have made a really huge difference. Some of the trees that we planted in with some of you folks probably listening, those were big enough and tall enough that they were actually trees that the butterflies were using. Not only the grove was where butterflies were clustering when we went to do the Thanksgiving count this year, but also these rings of the cypress trees outside of the grove, helping to protect from the wind, but also creating a whole nother circle with the sun coming in out of the wind, where some of the butterflies were actually preferring to be. In the eastern population, along the roadsides, 6 years ago maybe, they started planting in milkweed in the Midwest and north. And the butterflies are flying, following streams oftentimes, and the roadways look from above like streams. And so these are areas that look interesting to them. And when they're looking for milkweed, sometimes they're finding them there. Mark Stone, our legislator, he has really done a lot of good of getting some monies for restoration work to be done, being used right now for habitat, for both overwintering habitat and for inland habitat. We just need more of that kind of thing. So pressure on our legislators, and also encouragement for their bills when they come up with bills to make sure that we can help.
Thank you, Martha. And we'll check in with you again next year. Stay safe.
You too. Thank you.